New revelations accusing the Southern Baptist Convention of covering up sexual abuse for years. The accusation is being made by a Kentucky woman who is suing her father, a former pastor, and the Southern Baptist Convention for physical and sexual abuse. A 288-page independent report accuses the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination, of stonewalling and denigrating survivors of clergy sexual abuse for nearly 2 decades. Allegations first surfaced in 2019 following a report by the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News documenting hundreds of alleged cases in Southern Baptist churches, including several in which the alleged abusers remained in ministry.
You're dealing with evil that spans over years across our nation, in these churches and in the denomination as a whole.
That independent report was requested by the Southern Baptist Convention itself. It includes recommendations for how the SBC can move forward, such as restricting the use of non-disclosure agreements.
Election Day in Arkansas is tomorrow. 5 News reporter Catherine Gilker joins us with what you need to know in order to vote.
Plus, the president making international headlines for his response to a question about what would happen if China invades Taiwan. What the White House is now saying about all this.
Good evening and welcome to your 5 News at 5. I'm Erica Thomas.
And I'm Darren Bobb. A new report commissioned by the Southern Baptist Convention describes decades of cover-ups with its clergy members and leadership.
A former Northwest Arkansas pastor is named in that report dozens of times. 5 News reporter Michael Wilson is here with more on that connection. Micah?
Yeah, Erica and Darren, Rodney Floyd, the former senior pastor of Cross Church, is mentioned in that report more than 120 times. And we reached out to Cross Church multiple times today, but have not heard back. Floyd served as the president and CEO of the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee. Now, an independent investigation concluded that members of the committee responded with resistant stonewalling and even outright hostility to almost 2 decades of sexual abuse allegations against clergy. And Floyd resigned from his role as president and CEO in October of 2021 while criticizing decisions made by the third-party review. According to the report, they kept a secret running list of accused Baptist ministers to avoid being sued, even as the committee publicly claimed it didn't have the authority to create such a list. The document quotes a May 2019 internal email where the SBC's then general counsel called the focus on the sexual abuse, quote, a satanic scheme to completely distract us from evangelism. Survivor Hannah Kate Williams filed a lawsuit against the SBC on Friday, alleging that she was physically abused by her own father, a pastor, for years. Williams says when she reached out for help, nothing was done by the SBC.
Every day is a struggle since I've come forward publicly.
Yeah, now in that statement, the SBC's executive committee said that it was reviewing the report and is, quote, committed to doing all we can to prevent future instances of sexual abuse in churches. Michael Wilson, 5 News.
All right.
At 6, a bombshell investigation reveals decades of alleged abuse at Southern Baptist churches, including some here in Metro Atlanta.
Pastors at some local Baptist churches that are members of the Southern Baptist Convention called for an investigation into the matter. And this week, a 300-page report was released highlighting apparent mistreatment of abuse survivors. CBS 46's Adam Murphy is joining us live at Rehoboth Baptist Church in Tucker, where the pastor has been pushing for an investigation into the Southern Baptist Convention to try to get to the bottom, Adam, of this alleged abuse.
Well, good evening, Rick. I can tell you Pastor Troy Bush here at Rehoboth Baptist Church in the Tucker community told me that he is a member, or their church is, of the Baptist Convention. And last year, he called on the convention's executive committee to look into allegations of abuse, not at his church, but at other Baptist churches. And as a result, the investigative report, which just came out, asserts that an executive committee staffer maintained a list of Baptist ministers accused of abuse, but there is no indication anyone took any action to ensure that the accused ministers were no longer in positions of power.
Lower your ballots. The affirmative has it.
Nearly a year after church leaders met at the annual Southern Baptist Convention meeting, an independent investigation reveals decades of alleged disregard for abuse survivors and attempted cover-up by the convention's executive committee.
My first reaction was just a heartbreak.
Brandon Nichols is pastor of Mercy Hill Church in Marietta and his church is a member of the convention. He and some of his fellow faith leaders say they were aware of some of the alleged cases of abuse, but said the convention's executive committee failed to take action.
The report really was designed to ask the question, how in our organization, specifically with the executive committee, have we fallen short in responding to abuse cases? In what ways are we mishandling abuse cases?
Guidepost Solutions conducted the investigation and identified over 400 cases of abuse dating back decades. One of those claims involved former Southern Baptist Convention President Dr. Johnny Hunt. The former pastor of First Baptist Church of Woodstock is accused of sexually abusing another pastor's wife.
He is not someone in our denomination who any sort of hint of that sort of behavior issue had ever been come out or alluded to.
CBS 46 reached out to Dr. Hunt to get his side of the story, but his attorneys advised him not to speak with the media. Instead, he released this statement, which says in part, "To put it bluntly, I vigorously deny the circumstances and characterizations set forth in the Guidepost report. I have never abused anybody."
We believe that we're made right before God, not by our actions, but because of Jesus. And so we should be the first people to admit our wrongdoing and ask for forgiveness. And I think this situation demands that.
Now, I reached out to the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention. They sent me a statement saying, in part, "We are grieved by the findings of this investigation. We are committed to doing all we can to prevent future instances of sexual abuse in churches." We'll learn a lot more coming up next month when the Southern Baptist Convention meets in Anaheim, and this will be on the top of the list for discussion. We'll have more on this developing story in the coming weeks. We're live in Tucker tonight. Adam Murphy, CBS 46 News.
Thank you.
We are turning now to a bombshell new report on sexual abuse allegations and an alleged cover-up by leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention. The report details a list of hundreds of ministers accused of abuse, many of whom were allowed to keep positions of power. ABC's Renan Ali has the story.
This morning, new revelations accusing the Southern Baptist Convention of covering up sexual abuse for years. A 288-page independent report accuses the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination, of stonewalling and denigrating survivors of clergy sexual abuse for nearly 2 decades. A charge also being made by this Kentucky woman.
My father, my abuser, would baptize me, and that baptism would also work as a type of waterboarding.
Hannah Kate Williams is suing her father, who is a former pastor, and the Southern Baptist Convention, among others, for physical and sexual abuse she says began when she was 8 years old.
We are dealing with evil that spans over years across our nation, in these churches and in the denomination as a whole.
Allegations first surfaced in 2019 following a report by the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News documenting hundreds of alleged cases in Southern Baptist churches, including several in which the alleged abusers remained in ministry.
Abuse is one of the most underreported crimes, and so I think there's many more that we have yet to hear about.
SBC President Ed Litton said Sunday he is grieved to my core for the victims and said, "I pray Southern Baptists will begin preparing today to take deliberate action to address these failures." That independent report was requested by the Southern Baptist Convention itself. It includes information on how the SBC can move forward, such as restricting the use of non-disclosure agreements. Rhiannon Alley, ABC News, New York.
For more than 2 decades, leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention covered up and lied about accusations of sexual abuse. That from a scathing new investigative report that the church itself commissioned. It's the largest Protestant denomination in all the country, roughly 14 million members. One former Southern Baptist leader says this is much more than just a crisis for the church. He says it's an apocalypse. The president of Southern Baptists told members to prepare for what he calls deliberate actions to address these failures. Here's NBC's Ann Thompson.
This is the reckoning Hannah Kate Williams wanted when she and others asked the Southern Baptist Convention for a third-party investigation of sexual abuse.
Do you feel vindicated by the report?
In a lot of ways, yes.
She is suing the SBC for failing to take action against her father, who she says sexually abused her starting at age 8 as he studied to become a pastor.
I was met with, well, you're an enemy of God. It was threats, harassments. I had to move from my home.
The lengthy report details how survivors like Williams encountered resistance, stonewalling, and even outright hostility from some in SBC leadership starting in 2000. One leader claiming it is a satanic scheme to completely distract us from evangelism. Yet investigators found one staffer compiled a secret list of accused abusers with hundreds of names.
What does this do to the reputation of Southern Baptists?
You know, for a group that talks a lot about sexual morality, talks a lot about men protecting women and children, I think that this is obviously a very bad look, and it is clear hypocrisy.
SBC President Ed Litton says Southern Baptists must resolve to change our culture and implement desperately needed reforms. The report recommends creating and maintaining an offender information system, providing a resource toolbox with protocols and training, and making a sincere apology to survive. Healing won't come easy. Popular evangelist Beth Moore, who left the SBC last year, today tweeting, "You have betrayed your women. It's too late to make it right with me. It's not too late to make it right with them." For the news, I'm Ann Thompson.
A new investigation into the Southern Baptist Convention says top leaders, quote, stonewalled survivors of clergy sex abuse. An independent firm wrote the nearly 300-page report at the request of the Southern Baptist Executive Committee. The Associated Press says it includes recommendations to keep track of offenders, form a system to the community to let know about known offenders, and provide resources for training and education. In February of last year, Antioch Baptist Church in Sevierville was ousted after a committee discovered court documents showing the pastor was convicted of statutory rape in 1997. He was hired by the church in 2014, and denomination leaders say the church knew his criminal history, which breaks Baptist views on sexual abuse. In a statement today, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, Ed Litton, said he's grieved to the core for the victims. He also called on Southern Baptists to prepare to change the denomination's culture and implement reforms.
I committed adultery.
These are the pro-life goons, again, who are stripping Americans of their rights. Okay? These disgusting, disgusting people who think that they're entitled to violating the bodies of their own parishioners now get to make decisions about what women get to do with their own bodies. It's disgusting. In fact, one head pastor of the Seaford Baptist Church said of the report, "It makes you ill." It sure does, Michael Howard. It sure does. These people should have zero political power. Let me give you more. A select group of executive committee leaders largely controlled the committee's response to abuse reports, and they were singularly focused on avoiding liability for the Southern Baptist Church to the exclusion of other considerations. This meant that survivors and others who reported abuse were ignored, disbelieved, or met with the constant refrain that the SBC, the Southern Baptist Church, could take no action due to its policy regarding church autonomy, even if it meant that convicted molesters continued in ministry with no notice or warning to their current church or congregation. I'm sure Joe Rogan will be talking about this, right? Talking about the groomers and sexual abusers within the Southern Baptist Church, rather than needlessly defaming educators as groomers. I'm sure he'll do that, but let me continue. At the same time that senior leaders refused to take action, they compiled a private list of accused ministers in Baptist churches. There is no evidence that they shared this list or took any action to ensure that the accused ministers were no longer in positions of power at Southern Baptist Convention churches. Eventually, this list included a total of 703 abusers, with 409 believed to be SBC affiliated at some point in time. But they covered it up. They covered it up. Because who cares about the survivors of the sexual abuse? Who cares about their own parishioners? We got to protect the leadership, the evangelical leadership. We got to make sure that they have these pristine, great reputations as they essentially force their theocracy on the rest of the country in the form of doing away with the rights that we've had for over 50 years.
So let me explain what fundamentalist religion is about. Not all religion, but fundamentalists.
It's about garbage.
It's about protecting the power of men, period. So let me give you details about that. So this same Southern Baptist group, when there was a church, it's actually one of their biggest congregations in Southern California that ordained women ministers, pastors, you know what they did? Immediate investigation. Wait, you're raping little children hundreds of times, and you're like, well, I don't know if we should do an investigation. Women being in charge? Immediate investigation, okay? And a couple of churches did gay marriages and that were Southern Baptists. They didn't even do an investigation, immediately kicked them out. They're like, loving someone that we don't allow, no, unacceptable, unacceptable. You are not to celebrate love. You are not to celebrate the way you share power with anyone. Women, gay people, it does, no way, no way. They will stamp that out. But pedophilia, they're totally okay with it, as long as they're the ones who get to do it.
We're going to turn now to a disturbing story rattling the nation's largest Protestant denomination. Leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention released a third-party investigation that reveals decades of sexual abuse and its cover-up, including how church leaders allegedly mishandled abuse claims, resisted reforms, and belittled victims. The explosive 288-page report details 20 years of abuse allegations at every level of the church and sent shockwaves among the 13 million Southern Baptists nationwide. Among the report's most unsettling findings, church leaders allegedly maintained a list of offenders, but kept it secret to avoid potential lawsuits. Our next guest was the group's former policy head who left last year, and he called this report an apocalypse, saying it revealed, quote, a reality far more evil and systemic than I imagined it could be. Joe?
Yeah, let's bring in Russell Moore right now. He's the public theologian at Christianity Today. He's also director of their public theology project. Russell, you and I both grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. I know your story. We're friends. I think it's safe to say it was the center of our lives growing up. It was the institution that really we spent the most time with. So I must ask you how much this hurts you that you actually were pushing for this investigation. You begged them to investigate these claims of abuses. Then you got attacked. They lied repeatedly. I just tell me how were you grappling with this?
Well, I'm mad as hell, Joe. I really expected this report to be bad because I had lived through so much. But even I was shocked by the depths of it. I could barely even swipe the screen to go from one page to the next because my hands were trembling with rage. And a good deal of that has to do with exactly what you mentioned. The Southern Baptist Church I grew up in was a safe place, a refuge for me. And the fact that it's not for so many of the kids and the survivors mentioned in this report, it's just enraging. I think about all the times when people told me, don't say crisis when you're talking about sexual abuse in the church. It's not a crisis. And they were right. Crisis is too small of a word. This is an absolute disaster.
Russell, they lied. They lied to church members. They lied to 13 million Southern Baptists, these leaders. They kept a secret database and lied and said they weren't able to keep the secret database. They knew what was happening among them. And they lied. And like you said, you got attacked for bringing attention to this, for calling it a crisis. And it's so much worse. Why did they keep lying about this list that they had of people who were preying on young children?
Well, and what I experienced was nothing compared to the sexual abuse survivors, really, really brave people who had come forward for years saying that these were problems. They tried to work patiently within the system. They tried to speak from outside the system. And in this report, one can see how they're called crazy, they're called satanic, they're called tools of the devil. And I think that the clear thing that one can see is the protection of an institution and the protection of themselves from some of these leaders, rather than caring about those who are harmed in the most horrific ways, and even worse, harmed in those ways in the name of Jesus, the very person who would stand against all of that.
Right. Here's more.
Southern Baptist leaders say that they will release a secret list of hundreds of pastors and staff members accused of sexual abuse.
The announcement comes after a scathing 288-page report detailed how the committee mishandled sex abuse allegations and stonewalled numerous survivors. One of those survivors is a woman from Jacksonville. News 4 Jax reporter Bree Isom joins us live tonight. And Bree, you've been digging through this report.
Yes, and it was honestly a tough report to read. You know, the woman says in the report that she was traumatized after this happened, and she tried to tell executives, but they wouldn't listen to her.
Judy, the Lord coming down with 10,000 saints.
The report states 44 women had reported to being victims of Daryl Gilliard, who was a pastor at First Baptist Church of Jacksonville. It lists one of the survivors of abuse by Gilliard being a woman from Jacksonville, Tiffany Thigpen, who had looked up to Gilliard as a pastor and friend. The report states that in the spring of 1991, after a meeting at the church, Gilliard attacked Thigpen and attempted to rape her, but she fought back and escaped. According to the report, Gilliard had been grooming Thigpen with late-night phone calls and promises of a summer job in Texas. According to the report, she was terrified and traumatized, so her and her mother went to an executive at the church to talk about the attack. The executive, named as Dr. Jerry Vines in the report, was dismissive of her claims and told her that it would be embarrassing if others knew about it. In the report, some executives with the Southern Baptist Convention called Daryl Gilliard a woman squeezer. It goes on to say people would call and report abuse to executives and that they would tell the people who called not to talk about it or wouldn't return their calls. Gilliard later went on to work at churches in Oklahoma and Texas where allegations resurfaced. The report says Thigpen wrote a letter to the bylaws work group in 2019 stating how Gilliard was allowed to move from church to church with prominent SBC figures vouching for him. No one on the bylaws work group responded to the letter. Thigpen also made a submission to the Credentials Committee as well. She says the process has taken an emotional toll, writing, quote, "Imagine telling for decades to a non-receptive audience, to an audience who abuses you with their shame and their hateful words against you." Pretty powerful words in that report. Now, we did get a statement from the First Baptist Church of Jacksonville from Dr. Heath Lambert, who's the senior pastor there. He says, "I am horrified and saddened by the abuse and cover-up of abuse that was chronicled in the SBC sex abuse report. That is particularly true of the abuse of a precious former member of First Baptist Church 30 years ago. It is sinful and wrong to abuse any human being, to counsel abuse victims to remain silent, and to protect abusers from exposure. The leadership of our church today demands strict screening of all staff and volunteers, strictly enforces policies protecting innocent people, and requires all accusations of abuse to be reported to the authorities. I call on any person involved in abuse or concealing abuse to confess this sin and seek reconciliation with those they have wronged." I'm reporting live in downtown Jacksonville tonight. Bree Isom, Channel 4, the local station.
A new report documents in devastating detail how the past leadership of the Southern Baptist Convention ignored sexual abuse allegations for the better part of 2 decades and sometimes silenced or tried to discredit accusers. Amna Nawaz has more on the details of this disturbing report and the challenges it poses.
Judy, the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., with about 14 million members across 47,000 churches. This independent report, over 200 pages long, examined hundreds of cases of sexual misconduct and abuse between 2000 and 2020. Among the findings, church leaders publicly fought calls to track ministers accused of abuse, even as they privately maintained a list hundreds of names long at one point. The report finds church leaders, quote, protected or even supported abusers for years. Joining us now is one of the survivors of church abuse, Anne Marie Miller. She is the author of Healing Together, a guide to supporting sexual abuse survivors, and a registered nurse in Dallas. Anne Marie, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you for your time. I know you've had a chance to go through some of the report. I'm sure you have seen the headlines. What was your reaction? Did anything surprise you?
Honestly, nothing really surprised me about the report. I'm so glad that it's here. I'm so glad that tangible steps have finally occurred after decades of this. But reading the report, unfortunately, nothing was really a surprise.
We should mention you grew up in the Southern Baptist congregation. You were 16, as you have spoken publicly before, when your abuse by one of the church leaders began in the 1990s. And years went by before you reported it to church officials. What happened after that? What was the response?
The response after I reported it was, initially it seemed like a good thing, like people were caring for me, but the actual organization ended up not reporting it to authorities and allowing the person that abused me to continue going up the ladder in the Southern Baptist Convention. So he was a high-ranking executive when he was finally arrested in 2018.
What was that like for you at the time to see that happen?
It was almost as traumatizing as the abuse itself.
And what about from the congregation? Did you get any response from them?
I actually had left the church at that point because I did not feel safe in the church, and I was really wrestling with my faith at that time.
It did take you years after that as well. You eventually went to the police, right? When church officials didn't do anything about it. What happened after that?
I went to the police thinking they weren't going to do anything because it had been 20 plus years since it had happened. But within 24 hours, they were investigating it, and he was arrested and eventually indicted for 4 sex abuse felonies. At that point, there was a large reckoning happening within the Southern Baptist Convention. A lot of abuse stories had come public. And I believe that it was kind of that moment that this task force and other investigations started to become finally necessary, because the media was finally pushing these stories forward, so they had to do something to address it.
Anne Marie, when you were younger, did you know of other people who had been abused? Were these kinds of stories known within the church?
They weren't. I grew up in small towns in West Texas, but I think they were probably happening. It's just not something you talk about in the church. You don't talk about sex in general. And so if you're abused, like with my own abuse, I didn't feel like I could talk about it because I didn't see it as abuse at the time, but I felt as if I was sinning, and I needed to protect this man of God who was abusing me, because it would look bad on God. It would look bad on the church. There was sin involved. There was so much shame involved in it that, especially with kids, and adults, you just don't know how to deal with that in such a religious environment.
There are details in this report, like how church leaders talked about survivors like you, how disparaging they were, how hard they worked to silence people like you. What was that like for you to read?
It's hard to see names that you are familiar with that are supposedly leading people to Christ, caring for others, showing compassion for the poor, and at the same time calling survivors satanic. And just saying, sometimes people would receive death threats from leaders within the Southern Baptist Church. I wasn't, but I have friends that received death threats from pastors within the convention, and that's just beyond comprehensible to me.
You know, we should note that unlike the Catholic Church, which has grappled with similar issues, there's no top-down hierarchy in the Southern Baptist Convention. Does that, to your mind, does that make accountability harder?
It does. It's something I always called the idol of autonomy. And it's kind of just a way for churches to escape, liability, or really for the whole organization. Because if you have something happen in this little church, then you can't sue the entire organization. They're not responsible. It's like, oh, that's their thing. They need to deal with it. We can't do anything else about it. And they dodge accountability.
So what would you like to see happen now? Now these hundreds of pages are out there. It's an independent report. There's some shocking revelations in here. What should happen next?
I think that the everyday person that goes to Southern Baptist churches need to really consider where they're spending their money and where they're going, and see that there are tons of survivors that need care and compassion, and know that this is true. This is objective documentation. It's not made up. So believe survivors and care for them.
So we should mention Church Executive Committee leaders said they're committed to doing all they can to prevent future instances of sexual abuse in churches. Do you believe that they will?
I guess we'll have to see. I don't know how to answer that question. I hope that they will. But we're going to need to see it. And we need a lot more than thoughts and prayers. We need tangible action.
That is Anne Marie Miller joining us tonight from Dallas. Anne Marie, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.